Ruth, stop interfering. This is our family decision, Brooke said across my dining table. Her voice was calm, almost patient, which made the sentence stranger. Beside her sat a folder asking me to release $175,000. I looked at her and said, "Then make the decision without my money." Ethan lowered his eyes. Brooke pressed her lips together and said that was not what she meant. I told her it was exactly what she meant. She wanted the freedom to make a decision without my questions while using money that still belonged to me. The contradiction was so plain that no one could soften it. If you are listening while driving, folding laundry, or drinking your first cup of coffee, tell me this: has anyone ever called your questions interference while still expecting your help? Sometimes people do not object to your involvement. They object to the moment your involvement includes the word no. My name is Ruth Mercer. I was 70 that winter and lived outside Madison, Wisconsin, in a brick ranch house Samuel and I bought 32 years earlier. He had been gone 6 years. Snow gathered along the back fence, and cardinals came to the feeder every morning, as if grief had never altered their schedule. I had spent most of my career in operations at a credit union. I liked clear records, balanced accounts, and signatures that meant what people thought they meant. Samuel teased me for reading every line before signing anything. Years later, that habit would matter more than either of us could have imagined. Samuel owned a small commercial refrigeration repair company. He started with 1 truck, a toolbox, and more patience than capital. By the time he sold the business, it had 12 employees and contracts with restaurants across the county. We were proud, but neither of us ever started spending like success was permanent. The proceeds from that sale became one part of our family trust. The rest came from investments, municipal bonds, and savings accumulated over decades. That winter, the trust was worth approximately $1,100,000. I did not walk around thinking of myself as wealthy. I thought of myself as responsible. Ethan was our only son, 46, thoughtful, capable, and allergic to conflict. He worked in hospital administration and could manage a department full of difficult people. At home, however, he often surrendered the first hard conversation to whoever spoke with greater certainty. Usually that person was Brooke. Brooke was 43 and efficient in ways I once admired without reservation. She booked appointments early, kept color-coded calendars, and remembered everyone's birthdays. She loved her mother fiercely. Under normal circumstances, that devotion made her generous. Under pressure, it could also make her treat urgency like authority. Her mother, Gail Porter, was 71 and lived alone in a condominium 20 minutes away. Gail and I were friendly, though not close. We exchanged holiday cards and saw each other at family dinners. She was proud of managing her own life and had never once asked me for money. That mattered later. My granddaughter, Ava, was 17 and beginning the exhausting season of college applications. She spent many Sunday afternoons at my kitchen table, laptop open, asking whether an essay sounded too serious. She called me Grandma Ruth when she wanted advice, and Grandma when she wanted cookies. I loved both versions equally. On a shelf beside my desk sat a small cedar box Samuel made the year Ethan was born. The lid never sat perfectly flat. Inside were Ethan's hospital bracelet, a tiny knitted cap, his first tooth in an envelope, and a visitor card with my maiden name typed incorrectly. I had carried those things through 3 moves. Samuel made the box because I had begun saving every small object connected to our son. He joked that I would eventually need a warehouse. I told him babies made ordinary things feel historic. He sanded the cedar smooth, carved Ethan's initials beneath the lid, and left enough room for a lifetime of evidence. By the time Ethan became an adult, the box stayed mostly closed. I did not need his childhood around me every day. I had photographs, memories, and the man himself. Still, I kept the bracelet because it reminded me of the first time I understood responsibility. It was heavier than love and more permanent than fear. The trouble that winter began with Gail's fall. Brooke called me before sunrise on a Monday and said her mother had slipped in the condominium bathroom. An ambulance had taken her to the hospital. Nothing was broken badly enough for surgery, but she was bruised, frightened, and suddenly less steady than before. I drove to the hospital with coffee for Ethan and a sweater Brooke had left at home. Gail looked smaller in the bed than I remembered. She hated the hospital gown and apologized for causing trouble. I told her falling was not a moral failure. She laughed weakly. Brooke did not laugh at all. She kept watching the monitor instead. Doctors recommended rehabilitation before Gail returned home. They also said living completely alone might no longer be wise without additional support. Brooke heard the sentence as a verdict. I heard it as information. That difference between us existed before either of us understood how important it would become. For the first week, everyone did what families usually do. Ethan handled insurance calls. Brooke spoke with social workers. I brought meals, washed Gail's robe, and drove Ava home after school. Nobody mentioned my trust. Nobody asked for money. We were simply trying to help a woman recover from a frightening fall. Then the numbers began arriving. Rehabilitation had coverage limits. Assisted living communities wanted deposits. Monthly costs were higher than Brooke expected. Gail's condominium was paid off, but she resisted the idea of selling it. She said losing her home right after losing physical independence felt like too much at once. I understood that. A home can become proof that your life still belongs to you. I told Gail there was no need to decide everything in 1 week. We could gather information first. Brooke thanked me for calming her mother. At the time, I did not realize she was also beginning to calculate what other resources existed nearby. The first question sounded harmless. Brooke asked whether trust investments could be sold quickly if there were an emergency. I said most investments were liquid enough, depending on the asset and tax consequences. Then I asked why she wanted to know. She said she was only trying to understand how trusts worked. A few days later, Ethan asked whether the trust had been created mainly for inheritance or also for family needs while I was alive. I told him it existed first for my security and estate planning. He nodded and said, "Of course." Then he changed the subject to Ava's applications. I noticed how carefully he had asked. I was not offended. Families should understand enough about estate plans to avoid confusion later. Samuel and I had never treated money like a forbidden subject, but there was a difference between knowing a plan existed and beginning to build present decisions around assets someone else still controlled. I had not yet seen that line crossed. One snowy evening, Brooke came by with folders from 2 assisted living communities. We sat at my kitchen table while the kettle steamed behind us. She showed me room rates, therapy costs, and medication fees. The numbers were sobering. I felt genuine sympathy for her. Fear makes arithmetic feel personal. Brooke said she could not imagine forcing Gail to sell the condominium just to pay for care. I asked what Gail wanted. Brooke said her mother was overwhelmed and should not have to make a financial decision while recovering. That was reasonable. Then Brooke added, "There has to be another way." I heard the emphasis. I suggested speaking with Gail's financial advisor, reviewing her insurance, and asking the social worker about benefits or care options. Brooke nodded, but her disappointment was visible. She had wanted a different kind of answer. I did not know exactly which one yet. I only knew my suggestions had not relieved her. After she left, Ava arrived with a college essay and a bag of cinnamon rolls. We spent an hour removing dramatic adjectives from 3 paragraphs about volunteer work. Her presence settled the kitchen. When she left, snow had begun again, soft and steady beneath the porch light. Ordinary life still felt intact. I put away the assisted living brochures and noticed Samuel's cedar box on the shelf. I opened it for no particular reason and touched Ethan's old hospital bracelet. The plastic was yellowing with age. Once he had been small enough that every decision about his safety belonged to me. That had not been true for decades. At the time, I thought the bracelet was simply making me sentimental. I closed the box and returned it to the shelf. I did not know Brooke would soon place my trust on paperwork I had never seen. I did not know a stranger would call to thank me for money I had never promised. Those facts were still ahead. What I knew was simpler. I had never minded helping my family. Samuel and I had helped Ethan many times, and I expected generosity to remain part of my life. What I minded even then was the faint sense that help was being counted before it was offered. Outside, snow gathered beneath the feeder while I closed the cedar box. Samuel and I did not become comfortable all at once. For years, comfort meant knowing the mortgage was paid on time and the refrigerator would survive another month. His refrigeration company grew slowly, one restaurant and grocery contract at a time. My credit union's salary gave us steadiness, while his business gave us possibility. I handled our household records because numbers relaxed me. Samuel handled equipment, employees, and clients because broken machines made sense to him. Every January, we sat at the kitchen table with coffee and reviewed the year. We never asked how rich we looked. We asked whether our choices still belonged to us. When Ethan was young, money was often spoken about in ordinary sentences. New shoes could wait. Music lessons could not. A vacation might become 2 nights at a lake instead of a week away. Samuel believed children should see restraint without feeling fear. I believed they should learn that wanting something did not make it owed. As Samuel's company became successful, our life changed less than people expected. We replaced old cars before they became dangerous, repaired the house properly, and traveled a little more. We did not buy a larger home. Samuel said success was useful only if it gave you options instead of creating new obligations. By the time Ethan started college, we could pay most of his tuition without borrowing. He worked summers and covered smaller expenses. We paid the rest because we wanted him to begin adulthood without heavy debt. Samuel wrote a note with the first tuition check. This is help, not a claim on your future choices. Years later, when Ethan married Brooke, we contributed to the wedding. We also helped with closing costs on their first home. Neither gift came with repayment terms, and neither reduced some invisible inheritance balance. Samuel and I gave because the moment made sense, not because we were advancing money from a future account. That distinction mattered to us. An inheritance is not a running tab where every kindness is charged and every disappointment deducted. It is an estate decision made by living people who still have needs, risks, and choices. A future gift is not a present account. I had repeated that principle for years. When Ava was little, we paid for 2 summer programs and later helped with orthodontic expenses. Brooke thanked us sincerely. Ethan did too. Nothing about those years felt transactional. That was partly why the new questions about my trust felt so unsettling. They did not sound like requests. They sounded like planning assumptions. Samuel sold his company 7 years before he died. The buyer kept most employees and paid the purchase price over several structured installments. We met with accountants and Patricia Sloan to decide what to do next. A large share went into diversified investments rather than sitting in one account, where it looked temptingly simple. Patricia helped us create the Revocable Family Trust as part of a broader estate plan. It held investments, municipal bonds, and later additional savings. Samuel and I remained in control while living. Ethan was named as a future beneficiary. Future was the important word. He did not own the principal, while either of us did. Samuel understood that emotionally, before I understood it legally. He once said, "If we tell Ethan too much too early, he may start carrying money he doesn't have." I laughed because Ethan had never seemed entitled. Samuel shook his head and said, entitlement was not the only danger. Expectation could shape choices too. We kept the trust private, but not mysterious. Ethan knew an estate plan existed. He knew Ava was included in some way. He knew we had enough to remain independent. What he did not know was the exact balance from month to month. We thought that was healthy. Our security did not need to become his spreadsheet. After Samuel died, Patricia reviewed everything with me. I became the only person responsible for decisions that once belonged to two people. The trust had grown to approximately $1,100,000 by that winter. Seeing the number did not make me feel powerful. It made me feel accountable. I thought about Samuel whenever markets moved sharply. He hated watching daily fluctuations and preferred quarterly statements. I was more attentive, but I followed the same principle. The money existed first to keep me independent through whatever years remained. What survived me could become inheritance. That order was intentional. Ethan never challenged that order before Gail's fall. If I paid for dinner, he thanked me. If I offered help, he sometimes refused it. Once, after a furnace repair at his house, he told me they would handle the bill themselves. I remember feeling proud that generosity had not made him helpless. That memory complicated everything later. Brooke also had reasons to believe I might help. I had been generous during difficult seasons. When Ava needed a medical procedure not fully covered, I paid part of the bill. When Ethan changed jobs and their budget tightened, I helped with 1 month of property taxes. Each time the request came before the money. That sequence had protected us more than I realized. They asked. I considered. I answered. Sometimes yes came quickly. Sometimes I needed time. Once I said no to an expensive home renovation, they wanted help funding, and the family survived perfectly well. A healthy gift begins with the giver still owning the answer. The winter after Gail's fall, that sequence started reversing. Questions about liquidity came before a request. Care estimates appeared before anyone asked whether I wished to participate. Ethan used phrases like family resources. Brooke spoke about what would make sense. My consent had begun moving toward the end of the process. I did not confront them immediately. Part of me assumed stress was making everyone clumsy. Gail's situation was frightening, and fear can make good people speak as if options are obligations. I kept reminding myself of that. Compassion mattered, but compassion did not require me to ignore patterns that would matter later. One afternoon, I pulled out an old trust summary Patricia had prepared after Samuel's death. The document explained who controlled assets, who could benefit, and when future distributions might occur. I read the page slowly. Nothing in it described Ethan's inheritance as available during my lifetime because someone else faced a crisis. I made tea and carried it to the window. Snow had covered the feeder tray, and a cardinal stood on the railing waiting for seeds. I brushed the snow away, refilled the feeder, and watched it return. Small routines helped me keep problems their proper size. Gail needed care. That did not mean every nearby asset belonged in the solution. Later that evening, Ethan called. He asked whether Samuel had ever intended part of the trust for family emergencies. I told him Samuel intended me to have security first. Ethan said he understood and sounded almost embarrassed. Then he asked whether a large withdrawal would create a tax problem. The question was more specific. I asked how large. He said he did not know yet. I asked what the money would be for. He said Brooke was modeling several options for Gail. I told him models should not include my trust until I had agreed to participate. He said, "That's fair, Mom." His voice was sincere. I wanted that sincerity to be enough. After the call, I opened Samuel's cedar box. Ethan's hospital bracelet lay beneath the knitted cap, still printed with his newborn name. I remembered how absolutely dependent he had been on us. Feeding, warmth, safety, medicine, every decision. Parenthood begins with complete responsibility. The hard part is knowing when that stage has ended. I had never stopped being Ethan's mother. I never would. But motherhood at 70 could not mean treating a capable 46-year-old man as if every difficult choice remained mine to solve. Love had to change shape as children became adults. Otherwise, protection could become a way of preventing them from carrying their own lives. The next Sunday, Ava came over to work on scholarship applications. She asked whether asking for financial aid made her look unprepared. I told her no. Asking clearly was responsible. Assuming someone would pay without asking was different. The sentence came out before I realized how closely it matched what I was thinking about her parents. Ava nodded and went back to her laptop. She had no idea the trust was becoming a subject in adult conversations. I wanted to keep it that way. Her college choices should not become leverage in someone else's argument about inheritance. If I helped her, I wanted the help directed toward her future, not filtered through pressure. That night, I reviewed the beneficiary section again. Ethan was still named as Samuel, and I had chosen years before. Nothing had changed on paper. Yet something had changed around the paper. Expected inheritance had entered the vocabulary of a present problem. Once that happens, money can begin shaping decisions before it ever changes hands. I closed the binder and placed it back in the cabinet. I was not preparing for a fight. I was trying to remember the rules Samuel and I had lived by before grief and family pressure blurred them. Give freely, ask clearly, never spend tomorrow's gift today. Those rules had kept generosity clean for decades. Outside, the snow had stopped, and moonlight reflected from the yard. I held the cedar box for a moment before returning it to the shelf. Ethan had been protected by my hands once because he had no other way to survive. Now he had a home, a career, a wife, and choices. My love remained. The dependency did not. By the second week of Gail's rehabilitation, the doctors stopped talking only about recovery and began talking about what came after. She could walk with a cane, but her balance remained uncertain. A social worker suggested assisted living, at least for a while. Brooke wrote down every word, as if missing one might cost her mother a future. Gail hated the phrase assisted living. She said it made her sound older than she felt. I understood. Independence is partly practical and partly emotional. When other people start discussing where you should live, even careful advice can feel like a verdict. I told her we would look at options without deciding anything that day. Brooke asked me to come on the first tour because she said I made Gail calmer. I agreed. The building was clean, warm, and bright, with a small library near the lobby. Gail liked the courtyard. Then the director showed us the monthly rate, medication fees, and care-level charges. Brooke's face changed before she could hide it. The second place cost even more. A third required a larger entrance deposit. Gail kept asking whether she could return to her condominium with home care instead. The social worker said that might work if enough support could be arranged. Every option seemed to move the problem somewhere else rather than make it disappear. I drove Gail home from one appointment while Brooke followed in her car. Gail stared out the window at frozen fields and said she did not want to sell her condominium. She had lived there 12 years. It was paid for. After losing her husband and then her balance, she did not want to lose her address too. I did not tell her what she should do. I said, then we should understand every option before deciding. She squeezed my hand at a red light. That small gesture reminded me that helping someone think is different from deciding for them. It was a distinction I wished everyone around us could have held on to. Brooke, however, heard Gail's wish as a command to preserve the condominium at almost any cost. She began gathering numbers: property taxes, association fees, insurance, assisted living rates, home care hours. By the end of the week, she had built 3 spreadsheets and spoken to 2 financial counselors. At first, I admired the effort. Brooke had always handled fear by organizing it. Lists gave her something to do when feelings became too large. The problem was not the spreadsheets themselves. It was the moment my trust began appearing in the questions she asked about what resources the family might have. She called one evening and asked whether municipal bonds inside a trust could be sold quickly. I said some could, depending on terms and market conditions. Then I asked why she wanted to know. She said she was comparing liquidity across possible sources. The phrase possible sources stayed with me after we hung up. 2 days later, she asked whether selling investments inside the trust would automatically create a large tax bill. I gave her a general answer and told her Patricia would know the exact details. Brooke said she did not need legal advice yet. She only wanted to understand what would happen if money had to move quickly. Had to move for what? I asked. She paused, then said Gail's care. I reminded her that Gail had assets of her own, including the condominium. Brooke answered that selling the condo during a crisis would be cruel. I said I understood the concern. Understanding it did not answer who should pay instead. Ethan called that weekend. His tone was gentle. He said Brooke was overwhelmed and asked me not to take every question personally. I told him I was not offended. I was paying attention. He said they were simply trying to see the whole picture before making a decision. It's just planning, Mom, he said. I asked whether planning included my trust. He hesitated. Then he said only as one possible family resource if things became difficult. I told him the trust was not a family checking account. He said he knew that and apologized if the question sounded presumptuous. His apology was sincere enough to make me soften. For several days, I decided the matter was probably stress. I kept helping. I drove Gail to physical therapy twice, brought soup, and sat with her while she sorted mail. We talked about ordinary things whenever possible. She wanted to know whether cardinals stayed through winter. I told her mine seemed determined to. One morning, a bright red cardinal landed on the feeder outside my kitchen while Brooke sat across from me with another folder. Snow had crusted along the window edges. I poured tea and watched the bird peck at sunflower seeds. Calm images became useful because Brooke's folders were beginning to make every conversation feel like a meeting. This folder contained cost projections for 6 months of assisted living. Brooke had highlighted one total in yellow. She said the number was frightening but manageable if everyone participated. I asked who everyone meant. She said Ethan, herself, Gail, and family support if needed. She did not say my name, but she looked directly at me. I asked what Gail could afford from income and savings. Brooke said some, but not enough without drawing down assets quickly. I asked whether the condominium had been appraised. She said no because selling it was the last option. That order mattered. My money had entered the conversation before Gail's largest asset had even been valued. Brooke said Gail deserved to keep something familiar while adjusting to care. I agreed. Then I asked whether preserving that familiarity required someone else to absorb the cost. She said families helped each other all the time. I told her yes. Helping is a choice, I said. It cannot begin as an assumption. Her expression tightened, but she changed the subject. She asked whether I had ever taken a large distribution from the trust for myself. I said yes, when I replaced the roof and later when I bought a new car. Brooke nodded slowly. She was not asking about my spending history. She was testing how accessible the principle was. That realization did not make me angry. It made me careful. I told her any major decision involving the trust would go through Patricia and my financial advisor. Brooke said involving professionals would make everything slower. I replied that slowing down was sometimes exactly what money needed when emotions were moving too fast. Later that afternoon, Ava came over after school. She was working on scholarship essays and complained that every application wanted her life summarized in 500 words. We laughed, made hot chocolate, and edited sentences together. For an hour, nobody discussed care costs, inheritance, or liquidity. The quiet felt medicinal. Ava mentioned that her parents had been arguing more often. She did not ask why, and I did not volunteer adult details. I told her families become tense when someone is sick or frightened. She nodded and returned to her laptop. I was determined not to let my granddaughter become a messenger between rooms she did not belong in. The next day, I met Gail for coffee near the rehabilitation center. She looked stronger and had started using the cane with more confidence. I asked whether she had decided anything about the condominium. She said no. Then she admitted Brooke kept telling her not to worry because family money would make everything work. I asked what Gail thought that meant. She shrugged and said she assumed Ethan and Brooke had savings she did not know about. She had no idea my trust was part of the discussion. That surprised me. Brooke was speaking about family resources in one direction and keeping the details vague in the other. I did not correct Gail immediately. I did not want to create conflict while she was recovering. Instead, I asked whether she would sell the condominium, if that became the safest financial choice. She looked sad, then said yes. I don't want to, she added, but I won't ruin my children's lives to keep a building. That sentence stayed with me all afternoon. Gail was afraid of losing her home, but she understood that fear did not automatically transfer responsibility to someone else. Brooke, trying to protect her mother, had become more absolute than the person she was protecting. Love can become controlling when it refuses to let reality enter the room. That evening, Ethan stopped by with a bag of groceries for me. I told him what Gail had said. His face changed. He admitted Brooke had been insisting the condo should be preserved. I asked whether he agreed. He said he did not know. Then he added that selling it quickly might mean accepting less than it was worth. I told him that was a legitimate concern. Then I asked whether it justified planning around money I had not offered. He rubbed his forehead and said nobody had made any decision. I answered, "Then keep it that way until everyone whose money is involved has actually agreed." He nodded, but I could see how tired he was. After he left, I reviewed my trust statement without changing anything. The balance was still near $1,100,000. Numbers that large can create a dangerous illusion. They look endless when they belong to someone else. I knew every dollar represented choices Samuel and I had postponed, protected, or survived. Before bed, I checked my phone and found a new message from Brooke. She had sent another spreadsheet. Beneath it was one question. If we ever needed cash quickly, how long would it take to move money out of the trust? I read it twice. Outside, a cardinal settled near the feeder as snow began falling again. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was clearing snow from the back steps. My phone rang inside and I almost let it go to voicemail. The woman introduced herself as an admissions coordinator from the assisted living community Brooke had toured with Gail. Her tone was warm and professional. The number on the display was unfamiliar. She said she wanted to thank me for helping make Gail's transition possible. I assumed Brooke had listed me as a family contact. Then the woman mentioned a family funding commitment of $175,000. I stopped beside the kitchen counter and asked her to repeat the amount slowly. She did. Then she thanked me again for agreeing to provide part of the funds through the Mercer Family Trust. I looked toward the cedar box on the shelf. For several seconds I said nothing. No transfer had been discussed with me. No amount had been approved. I had promised nobody $1. That certainty came quickly. I asked exactly what paperwork she was reading. Her voice became more careful. She explained that the documents were preliminary financial planning forms, not a binding guarantee from the trust. Brooke had identified expected family resources while discussing how Gail's care could be funded. I asked whether they had verified that statement with me. I asked whether my name appeared anywhere. The coordinator said the form listed the Mercer Family Trust as an expected family source of funds. Beneath that line was an estimated contribution of $175,000. The entry was not signed by me. That fact mattered, but it did not calm me. I told her clearly that I had authorized no commitment and that nobody had permission to represent the trust as available. She apologized and said she would flag the file immediately. I thanked her for calling before anything moved further. Professional caution had done what family communication had failed to do. Before we ended, I asked for copies of every document that named me or the trust. She said she would send what she could and direct any formal requests through their finance office. I wrote down her name, the time, and the exact words she used. I asked her not to summarize anything. Old work habits returned faster than anger. When I hung up, I stood at the kitchen window and watched snow slide from the bird feeder roof. A cardinal landed, shook its wings, and began eating as if nothing had changed. I envied the simplicity of that small life for a moment. Then I made coffee and opened a fresh page in my notebook. The kettle clicked off behind me. I wrote 3 facts. First, no money had left the trust. Second, no valid trust guarantee existed. Third, Brooke had still used my assets to make her mother's plan look financially possible. The distinction mattered. I underlined the third one. I did not need a crime to recognize a boundary had been crossed. Ethan answered on the second ring. I asked whether he knew Brooke had listed the trust as an expected source of funds. Silence followed. Then he said she had shown him a draft budget, but he had not realized the facility had received anything with the trust name directly. His surprise sounded real. I asked whether he knew about the $175,000 figure. Another pause. He said Brooke had mentioned that amount as a possible bridge for Gail's care. I asked why he had not told me. Ethan said they were still working through options and had not wanted to worry me before anything was decided. You used my money to prove the plan worked before I agreed to the plan, I said. Ethan told me nobody had intended it that way. I asked how else it could be understood. He said the form was preliminary. I replied, preliminary does not mean imaginary. His voice dropped. He did not answer immediately, and I let the silence remain. He asked me not to call Brooke until he could speak with her first. That request told me more than he meant it to. Once again, he wanted time to prepare the person who had crossed the line before facing the person whose line had been crossed. I said, no, she can speak for herself. I was done cushioning consequences for him. Brooke called me 12 minutes later. She began by saying the facility had misunderstood the paperwork. I told her the coordinator had been quite clear. Brooke said the trust was listed only to show that family support might exist if Gail's savings became insufficient. I asked who gave her permission to show that. She said no one needed permission to list possible resources on a planning worksheet. I asked whether she would list a neighbor's investment account the same way. She said that was ridiculous because I was family. There it was again. Family was being used not as a relationship, but as a shortcut around consent. I asked where the $175,000 number came from. Brooke said she had estimated what 2 years of care might require after Gail's income and savings. I asked why the trust was assigned the gap instead of Gail's condominium. Brooke said selling the condo would be devastating to her mother. I understood that fear. I said so. Then I asked whether protecting Gail from selling her asset gave Brooke the right to promise mine. She told me I was making the issue too legal and not emotional enough. That surprised me. I had spent weeks driving, cooking, touring facilities, and listening to Gail's fear. Compassion is not a signature, I said. Brooke exhaled sharply. She said nobody had forged anything. I agreed. Then I told her the problem was not forgery. The problem was expectation. She had written my money into a plan because she believed my eventual answer could be managed later. That difference seemed to frustrate her. Brooke said she had assumed I would want to help once I understood the numbers. I asked why she had not waited for that conversation. She said deadlines were moving quickly. I told her urgency belonged to the problem, not to my consent. She went quiet long enough that I could hear traffic through her phone. The email from the facility arrived an hour later. I printed the pages and read them at the dining table. There it was in plain text. Mercer Family Trust, expected family source of funds. The estimated contributions sat beside it. No signature, no authorization. Still, my private asset had become a line item. I circled the phrase with a pencil. Years at the credit union had taught me that wording matters because wording becomes expectation and expectation becomes behavior. People often act around a projected resource before they have a legal right to it. That is how pressure gains momentum without anyone calling it pressure. I called Patricia Sloane's office and asked for an appointment later that week. I did not ask for emergency action. Nothing had moved yet. I only wanted the paperwork reviewed by someone whose loyalty was to the documents, not the family mood. Her assistant scheduled me for Friday morning. Facts were enough for now. Then I called the facility back and repeated my position in writing by email. I stated that neither I nor the trust had made any funding commitment. I asked that no future financial plan, admission decision, or internal note describe the trust as a guaranteed source without written authorization from me. The coordinator replied politely and confirmed the file would be corrected. I felt relief, but not victory. Gail still needed care. Brooke was still frightened. Ethan was still caught between people because he kept placing himself there. Correcting one line on one form did not solve the larger problem. It only revealed it. That evening, Ava stopped by with a scholarship form. I did not mention any of this. We ate soup, reviewed 2 essays, and argued about whether one sentence sounded too dramatic. Her ordinary worries gave me perspective. A family can hold several generations of need without one generation becoming responsible for every bill. After Ava left, I opened Samuel's cedar box and placed the printed facility form beside it. Ethan's newborn bracelet rested under the lid. I did not touch it. Instead, I looked from the bracelet to the line naming the trust. One represented a responsibility I had once carried by necessity. The other was being assigned by assumption. Brooke texted that night. She said she was sorry the wording upset me, but she hoped I would not let paperwork distract from Gail's urgent situation. I read the message twice. The apology was aimed at my reaction, not her decision. I did not answer. Some conversations become clearer when you stop correcting every sentence. The next morning, Ethan called again. He said Brooke had been crying and felt I was judging her for trying to protect her mother. I told him I was judging one action, not her entire character. Then I repeated the question I needed him to hear. Why was my money used before my answer existed? I waited. He said he did not know. That was the most honest thing he had said since the call began. I told him not knowing was a reason to slow down, not a reason to pressure me faster. He agreed. Then he asked whether I was still willing to discuss helping Gail. I said yes. Discussion had never been the problem. I placed the printed paperwork in a folder and set it beside Samuel's cedar box. Outside, snow fell in thin lines against the window. Nothing had left my trust, but something important had already moved. My family had begun treating a future possibility as present permission, and I was finally looking directly at it. Brooke changed her language after the facility corrected its file. She stopped calling the trust a possible family resource and began calling it Ethan's inheritance. The first time she said it, I thought she had misspoken. The second time, I understood the wording was deliberate. The change was small in sound and enormous in meaning. She called on Thursday evening and said Gail's care plan needed a realistic source of money. Then she added, Ethan's inheritance could cover the gap without forcing Mum to sell. I asked her to repeat the phrase. She did more slowly this time, as if clarity would make it reasonable. The certainty told me the number was not new. I said, eventually is not ownership. Brooke answered that everyone knew Ethan would inherit something someday. I told her someday was not a bank account, and my estate plan was not a promise she could schedule against. She sighed and said I was getting stuck on technicalities again. I kept my voice level. The principal needed no anger. The word technicality bothered me. Ownership is not a technicality when someone else is planning how to spend what you own. I did not raise my voice. I asked Brooke whether she would let me promise part of her retirement account to another family without asking. She said that was different. I had seen that distinction prevent expensive mistakes. I asked why. She said, because Gail's need was urgent, and because the trust would eventually benefit Ethan anyway. There it was again. Future inheritance had become present justification. The more frightened Brooke became, the more she treated time as if it had already delivered money into her hands. I told her I was willing to help Gail in ways I chose. I could review care options, contribute toward a specific expense, or help temporarily if needed. Brooke said partial help would only delay the real problem. She wanted a solution large enough to preserve Gail's condominium intact. A chosen gift was one thing, default payment was different. That distinction mattered. Gail needed care. Brooke wanted care plus preservation of an asset. Those were not the same goal. I sympathized with both, but only one was urgent. The other was a preference wrapped in fear. Preferences deserve consideration. They do not automatically choose who pays. Fear can disguise preferences as needs. The next afternoon, Ethan came by with coffee. He looked tired enough that I almost avoided the subject. Instead, I asked whether he also thought of the trust as his inheritance now. He stared at his cup. "I think of it as part of the family's future," he said. That answer told me more than a denial would have. I asked whether the family's future included my retirement, medical care, and whatever years I still had. He said, of course. I told him that answer had to come before every other one. The trust existed first to keep me independent. Whatever remained later could become a gift. Later still mattered. He knew I had never promised otherwise. Ethan said Brooke was terrified that Gail would lose the last thing she owned outright. I told him I understood that fear better than he realized. Samuel's death had made me cling to my own house in ways I never expected. But understanding why someone fears loss does not make another person's property available. He nodded, then asked whether I could at least look at a proposal before deciding. I said yes. Discussion was still welcome. What I would not accept was a proposal presented as something I had already morally agreed to. Ethan promised he understood. I wanted to believe the promise would survive Brooke's urgency. After he left, I made tea and watched a cardinal hop along the snow crust near the feeder. The bird pecked at one seed, then another, unconcerned with inheritance or care costs. I stood there longer than necessary. Quiet images helped me remember that every problem did not need to become enormous at once. The proposal arrived by email that night. Brooke had titled the spreadsheet Family Funding Plan. It listed Gail's income, savings, condominium value, projected care costs, and a line labeled Mercer Trust Advance. Beside that line was the same number the facility had mentioned before. She had even formatted the cells in soft gray and blue. $175,000. Seeing it inside a spreadsheet made the assumption look cleaner than it was. Columns can make entitlement appear objective. They do not show who was asked, who consented, or who carries the risk. Numbers can hide pressure when the labels sound reasonable. A formula could not supply consent. I noticed another detail. Gail's condominium was listed as an asset, but the column for sale proceeds showed 0. Brooke had entered a note saying the property should be preserved for emotional stability and future appreciation. My trust, by contrast, was treated as available liquidity. Her home was protected. Mine was expected to fund it. I called Brooke and asked why Gail's property had been protected in the model while mine had been assigned the withdrawal. She said Gail was vulnerable and should not be forced into a sale after a fall. I asked whether being vulnerable meant her asset was untouchable while mine became the first line of defense. Brooke said I was comparing unlike situations. Gail's condo was her home. The trust was money invested for the future. I told her the trust was also part of my security. Money can be a roof before it becomes an inheritance. The fact that it sat in accounts instead of walls did not make it less mine. She grew frustrated and said I had more than I could ever reasonably spend. That sentence landed quietly. I asked how she had decided what I could reasonably spend over the rest of my life. She said she did not mean it literally. I replied, Then don't use it as a reason to allocate my money. My future needs had become her estimate. For the first time, Brooke sounded angry. She said Gail was facing real consequences, while I was protecting a number on paper. I told her $1,100,000 was not a number floating above my life. It was my retirement, my medical reserve, Samuel's work, and decades of restraint. I did not tell her that to win. I told her because people often become casual about money once they stop imagining the life that produced it. Samuel had repaired refrigeration systems at midnight. I had balanced accounts through layoffs and recessions. The trust was not an abstract family reservoir. That weekend, Ava came over with college acceptance updates. She had received one scholarship and was waiting on 2 others. We celebrated with grilled cheese and tomato soup. I asked what she wanted most from college. She said, "To leave without making you or Mom panic about money." I smiled. Her answer was practical and kinder than she knew. I told her no 17-year-old should organize her future around protecting adults from every financial feeling. She laughed and said that sounded like one of my speeches. I let it. Her life deserved room to become something of its own. I did not want her education turned into another argument about the trust. After Ava left, I reviewed the spreadsheet again. Brooke had included a projected line for Ava's college costs, too, as though every future family expense belonged on one shared financial map. I closed the file. Family planning can become dangerous when one person starts building the map with everyone else's money. Ethan called Sunday night and said Brooke wanted us all to meet. I asked whether the meeting was to request help or to persuade me to approve the spreadsheet. He said both, then corrected himself. To ask, he said. The correction was small, but I noticed it. Words were beginning to reveal the real struggle. I told him I would come when they were ready to present Gail's own resources, honestly, alongside anything they hoped to ask from me. He said Brooke thought selling the condo first would be cruel. I replied, then she may argue for keeping it. She may not assume my money wins the argument for her. Ethan did not answer right away. He became quiet. Then he said he wished Samuel were there because Dad always knew how to make family decisions feel simple. I told him Samuel would have asked the same question I was asking now. Who owns the choice? Ethan gave a tired laugh and said I sounded exactly like him when I said that. The old kitchen felt less divided for a moment. That night, I opened the cedar box and held Ethan's newborn bracelet for a few seconds. I loved the man downstairs in every memory attached to that tiny band. Love did not require me to pretend he was still helpless. In fact, respecting his adulthood meant allowing him to face difficult limits. The bracelet circled 2 of my fingers now. Brooke sent another email before bed. She had revised the spreadsheet and added a section called repayment assumptions. The plan suggested Gail could reimburse part of the money if the condo was sold someday. Even repayment was built around the idea that my contribution would come first. The sequence still began with me paying first. I printed the new version and wrote one sentence across the top in pencil. A future gift is not current collateral. Then I placed the pages beside my trust binder. I was not closing the door on compassion. I was closing the door on language that turned expectation into entitlement. The pencil line reduced the spreadsheet to paper. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday. Brooke said she would bring the care estimates, the condo numbers, and a written proposal. I agreed. Then I looked once more at the email subject line. Family funding plan. My family had a plan. What it still did not have was my money. The distinction would define everything that happened next. Brooke and Ethan arrived at my house Tuesday evening, carrying 2 folders and a laptop. Gail was still at rehabilitation, so the meeting was only the 3 of us. Brooke placed everything on my dining table in careful rows. Care estimates, condo values, projected income, and one printed page labeled Family Loan Agreement. I made coffee before we began, because I wanted my hands busy with something ordinary. Snow tapped lightly against the kitchen window, and the kettle clicked off behind me. Brooke opened the laptop while Ethan sat beside her. No one raised a voice. That almost made the arrangement feel more reasonable than it was. Brooke started with Gail's monthly care costs. She had calculated 2 years of assisted living, therapy, medication management, and transportation. Then she subtracted Gail's income and current savings. The remaining gap was large. I understood why the number frightened her. Fear was not the part I objected to. Next came the condominium. Brooke said selling immediately could force Gail to accept a low offer and leave her feeling displaced while still recovering. She wanted to keep the property at least another year. I asked whether Gail agreed with that plan. Brooke said her mother was too overwhelmed to make a sound decision yet. Then she turned the laptop toward me. A highlighted cell showed $175,000 from the Mercer Family Trust. Beneath it, another line projected partial repayment after a future condo sale. Brooke said the trust could bridge the crisis without permanently costing anyone the full amount. Her tone stayed measured. I asked why the trust had to bridge anything before Gail's own property was used. Brooke said because the condo was more than an asset. It was security identity and the last home Gail had chosen with her husband. I understood every emotional reason. What I did not understand was why those reasons automatically became my financial obligation. Ethan said they were not asking me to give the money away. He slid the family loan agreement toward me. The document promised repayment from future condo proceeds, but no sale date was required. Interest was minimal. The paper used the word loan several times. It still depended on me carrying all the immediate risk. I asked who had drafted it. Brooke said she used a standard family loan template and adjusted the terms. I asked whether Patricia had reviewed it. She said no, because bringing attorneys into a family emergency would make everything colder and slower. I looked at the unsigned page and thought slowing down sounded exactly right. Then Ethan handed me a second page with transfer instructions from one of my investment accounts into a temporary care account. He said they had included it only so I would not need to figure out logistics later. The phrase "only so" made me tired. Every convenience had been prepared except my actual decision. I asked whether the assisted living community expected this money now. Brooke said they needed proof of a workable funding plan before final placement. I reminded her that the facility had already corrected its file after listing my trust without permission. She said that misunderstanding had made everyone more cautious, not less. For a moment, no one spoke. The furnace came on beneath the floor, and a branch scraped softly against the window. I watched steam rise from my coffee and tried to keep the problem the size it truly was. Gail needed safe care. Brooke wanted to preserve the condo. Ethan wanted peace. I owned the money. Brooke began again. She said $175,000 represented a small percentage of the trust and would not threaten my lifestyle. I asked how she had determined what threatened my lifestyle. She said she was not trying to control my spending. I told her the spreadsheet already assumed what I could spare. She leaned back and said we were getting lost in details. I told her details were where money became real. The trust was approximately $1,100,000, but that did not make any portion automatically excess. I could live 20 more years. I could need care myself. Markets could fall, life could change. Ethan asked whether I trusted him to repay what they could. I said trust was not the same as capacity. He looked hurt. I hated that. My son had never cheated me, but a promise tied to a future property sale was not a guarantee. Adults could be honest and still be unable to perform what fear had made them promise. Brooke said the condo would eventually be sold anyway, so the trust was only advancing money across time. I looked at her. That sentence revealed the entire problem. She spoke as if time itself belonged to the family. Future inheritance and future property sales were already being arranged around today's fear. I asked what happened if Gail lived longer than projected or needed a higher level of care. Brooke said they would adjust. I asked what happened if the condo market weakened. She said they would wait. I asked what happened if I needed the money back first. This time, neither of them answered quickly. Brooke finally said I was making a compassionate decision, sound like a commercial transaction. I told her it became a transaction the moment she placed a loan agreement and transfer instructions in front of me. She said those papers existed because I kept asking questions. I answered that questions were what responsible money required. Her face tightened. "Ruth, stop interfering. This is our family decision," she said. The room went completely still. I looked at the folder, the transfer instructions, and my son's hands folded beside hers. Then I said, "Then make the decision without my money." Ethan closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. Brooke said I knew what she meant. I told her I did. She wanted freedom from my questions while still using my assets. She said Gail's care was not about me. I agreed. "Then my trust should not be the thing that makes the plan possible," I said. Her expression shifted from anger to disbelief at once. Ethan spoke quietly. He asked me not to let Brooke's wording decide everything. He said Gail was frightened, the facility was appropriate, and the numbers were real. Then he said, "Mom, if you can help without hurting yourself, please consider it." His voice had none of Brooke's certainty. That made it harder to resist. I looked at my son and remembered every time he had asked me for almost nothing. Tuition help had come from us before he asked. The wedding gift had been our idea. He had refused money more often than Brooke knew. Hearing him ask now reached the part of me that still wanted to solve difficult things before they touched him. I asked for 10 minutes alone. Brooke started to say something, but Ethan touched her arm. They stayed at the table while I went to my office. I intended to retrieve a recent investment statement. I wanted to see whether the withdrawal could happen without damaging my own plans. I was considering yes. The file cabinet stuck slightly, so I opened the desk drawer for the small key I kept beside Samuel's cedar box. When I lifted the box to reach beneath it, the lid shifted. Ethan's newborn hospital bracelet slid over the edge and landed on the desk beside my hand. The tiny plastic band made almost no sound. I picked it up. His name was still faintly visible, along with the date from 46 years earlier. I remembered holding him in the hospital, terrified by how completely another life depended on me. He could not feed himself, move himself, explain pain, or choose anything. My responsibility then had been absolute. I stood there with the bracelet around 2 fingers and thought about the man downstairs. Ethan had a career, a home, a wife, and decades of adult judgment. Gail had assets. Brooke had choices. None of them were helpless in a hospital bassinet, waiting for me to keep the whole world safely beyond their reach. That was the distinction I had been avoiding. Protecting a helpless child had once been my duty. Protecting a capable adult from every painful financial decision was not. If I turned the trust into the first answer, whenever fear became large, I would not be helping Ethan grow. I would be financing avoidance. I put the bracelet back into the cedar box and closed the lid. Then I returned the investment statement to the drawer without taking it downstairs. My hands were steady now. The temptation had not vanished because Gail's need was still real. What changed was my belief that I alone had to make the difficulty disappear. When I returned to the dining room, Brooke looked at my empty hands. Ethan looked at my face. I sat down and pushed the family loan agreement back toward them. Brooke asked whether I wanted Patricia to review it first. I said no. Ethan asked whether I needed another day. I said no again, very quietly. I told them I would still help Gail search for care, review benefits, drive her to appointments, and consider specific gifts I chose myself. I would not release $175,000 as an advance against Ethan's inheritance. Brooke started to argue. I raised one hand and stopped her before the first sentence formed. No. I said it once. The transfer instructions remained untouched beside my coffee. Ethan looked disappointed, Brooke looked furious, and I felt sad for all of us. But sadness was no longer a reason to sign. Outside, snow settled quietly against the dark windows while I closed the folder and kept the trust where it was. I slept for less than 2 hours that night. At 3:40, I stopped trying and went to the kitchen. The house was dark except for the stove light. I made coffee and opened my notebook. At the top of a clean page, I wrote one rule: compassion, assistance, and authority are not the same thing at all. Compassion was easy to define. Gail had fallen, lost confidence, and needed care she had never expected to need. I could sit beside her, drive her, and listen to her fear. Sympathy still did not decide which account should pay for her future. That mattered. Assistance was different. Assistance was something I could choose in specific amounts and forms: a ride, a meal, a direct payment toward therapy, help with paperwork, a temporary gift if I wanted. Assistance kept my answer alive. It did not turn my trust into a standing resource for every difficult family problem. Authority was the part everyone had blurred. Authority meant the right to decide what happened to my money. Brooke had wanted that right, without calling it authority. Ethan had supported the plan, without naming it either. The spreadsheet, the loan paper, and the transfer instructions had all assumed my decision would eventually cooperate. I drew 3 separate boxes around those words. The page looked almost childish, but the distinction calmed me. Love had made the categories feel connected. Fear had made them feel identical. On paper, they were different again. I could offer compassion and assistance without surrendering financial authority. Outside, fresh snow softened the yard. A cardinal appeared at the feeder before sunrise, red against the grey morning. I watched it hop between seeds while the coffee cooled beside me. Quiet details helped me remember that I did not need to solve 20 years of care before breakfast or before anyone asked clearly. Then I listed the support Ethan and Brooke already received from me. I paid 1 annual family insurance premium, helped Ava with school expenses, and covered several holiday trips over the years. None of those choices bothered me. What bothered me was realizing how often I had made help arrive before they had to ask clearly. I listed the larger gifts too: college tuition, wedding support, closing costs, medical bills, 1 property tax payment during Ethan's job change. I did not total them. I was not building a case against my son. I was reminding myself that generosity had already been present without becoming a legal right. Then I wrote a question Samuel might have asked. If Ethan had no future inheritance at all, what would Brooke and he do about Gail's care? The answer came quickly. They would review Gail's condo, income, savings, benefits, and care options. They would negotiate with reality instead of waiting for my money to erase it. That realization hurt more than I expected. The trust had not created their problem. It had created an easier path around the problem. As long as they believed I would eventually release money, they did not have to fully test the harder options. My generosity had become a shortcut they were beginning to budget. At 6, I opened Samuel's cedar box again. Ethan's hospital bracelet lay where I had returned it. I touched the plastic once, then left it there. The lesson from the night before still held. A helpless infant required my protection. A capable adult required something harder from me, room to face consequences. I closed the box and wrote another sentence. Protecting Ethan now might mean refusing to protect him from every result of his own decisions. That felt almost backwards after a lifetime of motherhood. Yet adulthood had to mean something more than growing taller while your mother kept absorbing the risks. At 8:30, I called Patricia Sloane's office. Her assistant said Patricia could speak with me at 10. I showered, dressed, and gathered the facility paperwork, Brooke's spreadsheet, the unsigned loan agreement, and my current trust documents. I wanted facts arranged before emotion entered the room again. Patricia called exactly at 10. She asked first whether any money had been transferred. I said no. She asked whether I had signed the family loan agreement or transfer instructions. Again, no. Then she asked whether the care facility still showed the trust as a funding source. I told her the file had been corrected. She asked me to read the exact language from Brooks' preliminary paperwork. I did. Patricia said the form did not create a valid trust guarantee by itself. That relieved me. Then she added that the larger issue was behavioral, not merely legal. My family had begun planning around an expected inheritance while I was alive. I told her that sentence frightened me more than the paperwork. Patricia said it should concern me, but not panic me. Estate plans are allowed to respond to changed circumstances. She reminded me that the trust was revocable and that Samuel and I had always intended it to reflect current judgment, not old assumptions forever. We reviewed Ethan's future distribution terms. Under the existing plan, most of his share would eventually pass to him outright after my death. Patricia asked whether that still matched my intentions. I started to say yes out of habit, then I stopped. The answer no longer felt automatic, and that surprised me. Patricia did not fill the silence. She let me think. I pictured Brooks' spreadsheet, the phrase Ethan's inheritance, and the transfer instructions already printed. If expected money was shaping present decisions before Ethan owned it, what would happen when access became easier? The question was uncomfortable, but necessary to face honestly. I asked what other structures existed. Patricia explained that a future share could remain in a lifetime trust instead of distributing outright. Terms could limit access to principal, restrict assignment, and protect assets from being pledged as collateral. She spoke slowly, using ordinary language instead of legal shorthand. I asked whether that would mean I was punishing Ethan for Brooks' behavior. Patricia said the purpose mattered. If I changed the trust to hurt or control him, that was one thing. If I changed it because outright inheritance no longer matched the risks I saw, that was another. Documents should express intent, not revenge. That distinction settled me. I did not want to remove Ethan. I did not want to threaten him with disinheritance or make Ava afraid that family love depended on obedience. I wanted the trust to stop functioning as imaginary collateral in conversations I had never authorized. Protection could be structural instead of emotional. Patricia described a discretionary spendthrift structure for Ethan's future share. He could benefit from the trust under defined standards, but he would not simply receive the entire principal outright. He could not promise what he did not control. Brooke could not assign it. A lender could not rely on his expectations as a pledge. I asked about Ava. Patricia said we could create separate provisions for education and medical needs so her future did not depend on whatever pressure surrounded her parents. Payments could be made directly for qualified expenses. I felt immediate relief. Protecting a grandchild did not require giving her parents unrestricted control. Then Patricia asked the question that changed the morning. Do you still want Ethan to inherit outright? I looked at the cedar box on the counter. I loved my son. That was not in doubt. What had changed was my belief that love required giving future money in the least protected form possible. That belief no longer held. No, I said. The word came quietly. Patricia asked whether I was certain enough to begin drafting, or whether I wanted time. I told her I wanted to review every consequence before signing anything. But yes, I wanted a new structure prepared. For the first time, the answer felt deliberate rather than defensive. We also discussed stopping discretionary lifetime advances for the moment. Patricia suggested I avoid large, informal transfers while the family was treating inheritance as present planning capital. Specific gifts could still be made if I chose. The point was not to freeze affection, it was to stop expectation from operating the trust. Before ending the call, Patricia asked me to send copies of Brooks' documents and the facility correspondence. She would review everything, then prepare options for an in-person meeting. I thanked her. There was nothing dramatic in the process. That was part of its strength. Procedure gave fear fewer places to hide. After we hung up, I wrote one final sentence across the notebook page. An inheritance should not become collateral before the person leaving it is even gone. I read it twice. The line sounded severe at first. Then I realized it was simply accurate. Future generosity should not be spendable in advance. By noon, the snow had begun melting from the south side of the roof. Water tapped steadily into the gutter. I poured out the coffee I had made before dawn and discovered I had barely touched it. My family still had a care problem to solve. I simply understood now which part of that problem was not theirs to control. I rinsed the cold cup, returned the cedar box to its shelf, and placed Patricia's appointment on my calendar. Nothing legal had changed yet. Ethan was still my son. Brooke was still frightened. Gail still needed care, but the trust no longer felt like a question waiting for their answer. It felt like mine again. Patricia's office overlooked a narrow street where snow had begun turning grey at the curb. I arrived 10 minutes early with Brooke's spreadsheet, the facility emails, the unsigned loan agreement, and my trust binder. Patricia placed everything in separate stacks before asking me to say, in my own words, what I wanted changed. I told her I wanted 3 things. First, no one should be able to present the trust as a guaranteed family funding source without my written approval. Second, I wanted to stop large discretionary advances while I was alive. Third, Ethan's future share needed protection from the expectations already forming around it. Patricia repeated those goals back to me before discussing documents. That small step mattered. No one was translating my wishes into something more convenient for another person. She said the first action was simple, a written clarification to the assisted living community, stating that the trust had made no funding commitment. She drafted the letter while I sat across from her. It named the trust, referenced the earlier paperwork, and stated that no one except me had authority to commit trust assets during my lifetime. It also asked that future admissions or payment plans exclude the trust unless written approval came directly through my attorney. I read every sentence carefully. The letter did not accuse Brooke of fraud or bad faith. I did not want drama written into a professional record. It simply corrected the assumption and closed the opening that assumption had created. Patricia sent it that morning and copied me on the final version for my records. Next, we discussed lifetime gifts. Patricia reminded me that a revocable trust still allowed me flexibility under its terms. I could continue helping family if I chose. What she recommended was ending the pattern of large informal advances while everyone was treating expected inheritance like present capital. The distinction felt clean. I did not want a rule that prevented me from paying for Ava's education or helping during a true emergency. Patricia said specific gifts could still be made deliberately. The important change was that no one should expect a large transfer merely because a spreadsheet labeled it family support. I wanted each future yes to begin with a real question. Then she opened the section dealing with Ethan's inheritance. Under the current plan, most of his share would eventually pass to him outright after my death. Patricia drew a line beneath the distribution language. "This is the part you asked me to reconsider," she said. I nodded and felt surprisingly calm. She explained a lifetime discretionary spendthrift trust in ordinary language. Ethan's share could remain in trust rather than being handed to him all at once. A trustee would administer distributions according to the standards written into the document. Ethan could benefit without owning unrestricted principal outright. The spendthrift provisions also mattered. Patricia explained that Ethan would not be able to assign future trust interests to someone else or pledge expected distributions as collateral. Brooke could not sign his inheritance into a family plan. A lender could not treat an expectation as if it were cash already sitting in Ethan's account. I asked whether that meant Ethan would have no access at all. Patricia said no. The structure was not designed to starve or humiliate him. It was designed to separate benefit from control. Appropriate distributions could still support health, education, maintenance, and other purposes defined in the trust after my death. I asked who would decide those distributions. Patricia walked me through several possible trustee arrangements and the trade-offs of each. I chose a neutral professional structure rather than placing Brooke in control or forcing Ava into an adult financial role someday. The point was to remove pressure from relationships, not move it elsewhere. We spent almost an hour on wording. Patricia showed me how one clause affected another and where discretion lived. Whenever I did not understand something, I stopped her. Nobody sighed. Nobody told me deadlines were urgent. A trustworthy legal process gave me more time, not less, as the decisions became more important. Then we discussed Ava. I wanted her education and medical needs protected, without making her parents gatekeepers for every dollar. Patricia proposed a separate provision under which qualified expenses could be paid directly to schools, medical providers, or approved accounts. The money would serve Ava without becoming family liquidity. That part gave me immediate relief. I had worried that changing Ethan's future share might somehow punish my granddaughter. Instead, the new structure did the opposite. It separated her future from whatever pressure her parents were carrying. Protection did not require giving everyone access to the same pool of money. Patricia asked whether I wanted to reduce Ethan's eventual benefit because of what had happened. I said no. I was not trying to calculate a financial penalty for Brooke's behavior. I wanted to change the form of the inheritance, not turn affection into a scorecard. Ethan remained my son and remained a beneficiary. That distinction became the center of the amendment. Ethan was not removed. The trust was not emptied. Ava was not used as leverage. What changed was the path between future benefit and present control. The money could still help my family someday without becoming something they could budget, pledge, or promise now. We took a break before signing. I carried coffee to the window and watched meltwater drip from the roof across the street. A sheet of old snow loosened and slid down in one quiet piece. I thought about how pressure had accumulated in my family the same way, layer by layer, until one clear change finally released it. When I returned to the conference table, Patricia reviewed the amendment from the beginning. She summarized each effect. No guarantee to Gail's facility. No automatic large lifetime advances. Ethan's future share held in a protected discretionary structure. Separate education and medical protection for Ava. Every point matched my instructions. I asked one final question. Could Ethan still call the trust his inheritance? Patricia smiled slightly and said he could call it whatever he wanted. He could not control principal. He did not own or promise distributions he could not demand. Expected trust assets could not become present collateral. Labels no longer changed the mechanics. That answer settled me. For weeks, language had done too much work in our family. Family resource, Ethan's inheritance, bridge money, temporary advance. Each phrase had tried to make access feel natural, before consent existed. The amendment replaced persuasive language with structure. Structure did not care who spoke most confidently. I signed the first page, then the next. My hand did not shake. Patricia witnessed what needed witnessing and explained what would be stored with the trust records. The process was quiet. There was no satisfying slam of a door. There was only my name beneath terms I understood and had chosen without anyone waiting at home with a pen. Afterward, Patricia gave me a clean summary for my files. I read the paragraph describing Ethan's future share twice before closing the folder. I did not take Ethan out of the trust. I took the trust out of Ethan's plans. That sentence held everything I had been trying to do without turning love into punishment. We also updated contact instructions on the investment accounts connected to the trust. Patricia advised direct verification for unusual distribution requests and routing legal questions through her office. These were ordinary administrative protections, not secret traps. I wanted fewer opportunities for confusion, not more surprises. Before leaving, I asked whether Ethan and Brooke needed to receive the entire amended document immediately. Patricia explained what disclosure obligations applied and what could remain private under my current arrangement. I followed her advice. I was not going to use secrecy as theatre or disclosure as a threat. Procedure would decide the timing. I drove home through streets lined with dirty snowbanks and patches of exposed grass. Winter was beginning to loosen its grip on Madison. At a red light, I noticed how tired I felt. Not frightened, not triumphant, simply tired in the clean, quiet way that follows a decision you have postponed too long. At home, I placed Patricia's summary in the fire-resistant box with my other estate documents. Samuel's cedar keepsake box sat on the shelf above it. I opened the lid and looked at Ethan's hospital bracelet. The tiny band no longer asked me to rescue him. It reminded me that responsibility changes shape when children grow. I made tea and sat near the back window. The cardinal appeared again, bright against the shrinking snow. I thought about Gail. I still wanted her safe. I still wanted Brooke to find a solution she could live with. None of those hopes required my trust to remain available for plans made before my consent. That evening, the assisted living coordinator emailed confirmation that Ruth Mercer and the Mercer Family Trust had been removed as committed funding sources. The wording was plain, almost boring. I appreciated that. A problem that had entered my life through assumption was leaving the paperwork through correction, one line at a time. I closed the laptop and turned off the kitchen light. The trust still held approximately $1,100,000, subject to markets and future needs. Ethan was still my son. Ava was still protected. Gail still needed care. But one thing had changed completely. My family's future could no longer spend my present. Brooke learned about the amended plan 3 days later. Though Patricia never disclosed private terms, Ethan told her only that the $175,000 would not come and that future inheritance would no longer arrive as unrestricted cash. Brooke called me before dinner. Her voice was controlled enough to sound dangerous. She said I had punished Gail for asking for help. I told her Gail had never asked me for $175,000. Brooke said that distinction was cruel because she had been acting for her mother. I asked whether acting for someone gave her permission to promise another person's money. She did not answer directly. Then she accused me of changing the trust to humiliate Ethan. I said Ethan was still a beneficiary. I did not discuss private provisions beyond that. Brooke said protecting money from family was the same as saying family could not be trusted. I replied trust does not require unlimited access. My voice stayed calm. Ethan called an hour later. He asked whether Brooke was right that his inheritance had been locked because of the care dispute. I told him the dispute had revealed a risk I could no longer ignore. He said he would never deliberately misuse money. I believed him. Intent had never been the whole problem. I asked whether he had signed the family loan agreement if I had transferred the money. He said yes. I asked whether he had planned to repay me from Gail's condo someday. Again, yes. Then I asked what happened if the condo was never sold. His silence answered more honestly than a promise could have. The next morning, I drove Gail to a follow-up appointment. Brooke had not told her about the trust amendment, and I did not intend to use the car ride for that. Gail talked about physical therapy, sleep, and how much she missed making her own breakfast. She sounded stronger than she had a month earlier. After the appointment, Gail asked if we could stop for coffee. We sat near a window while snowmelt ran along the curb outside. She told me an assisted living apartment had opened and that the facility wanted final financial paperwork. Then she asked whether Brooke had been handling the money side correctly. I asked what Brooke had told her. Gail said only that family support would cover the gap, so she could keep the condo. I heard how carefully she had been reassured. I looked at her. Did you ask Brooke to protect the condo at any cost? I asked. Gail shook her head. No. I told her I was afraid to sell it. That is not the same thing. That sentence changed the entire conversation. Gail had expressed fear. Brooke had converted fear into a mission. I told Gail the truth as gently as I could. My trust had been listed as an expected funding source. I had never agreed to it. Her face went still. Then the color rose slowly into her cheeks. She asked whether any money had been transferred. I said no. She asked whether I had been pressured to provide it. I answered yes, but I did not describe Brooke as a villain. I told her there had been a proposal for $175,000 as a family loan. Gail closed her eyes. I kept my answers plain. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she whispered, "She promised your money to save my condo?" I told her Brooke believed she was protecting her. Gail looked out the window and said, "I did not ask her to do that." Her voice had more strength than I had heard since the fall. The question embarrassed her. I told Gail I was sorry she was learning this from me. She said she was glad she knew before signing anything herself. Then she surprised me. She said the condo should be sold. Not someday. Not after every other person had been asked to carry the cost. She said, "If my care needs the money, then my home pays first." I did not argue with her or congratulate her. Selling would still hurt. I asked whether she wanted time. Gail shook her head. She said she had already spent weeks realizing she might never live there alone again. Keeping the condo, because Brooke could not bear the sale, would not give Gail her old life back. We finished our coffee quietly. Outside, a plow pushed dirty snow toward the corner. Gail folded her napkin twice and said she wanted her own attorney to review the sale documents when the time came. I smiled. "Good," I said. It was the first decision in weeks that felt completely hers. It was ordinary, which helped. Brooke arrived at my house that evening without calling. Gail was with her. Ethan came separately a few minutes later. I invited them all into the kitchen because no one needed a dramatic setting. The cedar box stayed on its shelf. 4 mugs sat on the table, and I let the kettle give us something ordinary to hear. Gail spoke first. She told Brooke she planned to list the condo. Brooke immediately said no. The speed of the answer surprised even Ethan. Gail repeated herself. Brooke said selling now would waste money and destroy the last place connected to her father. Gail replied, "Your grief does not own my property either." Brooke stared at her mother. I saw the moment she realized the argument had shifted away from me. For weeks, she had presented herself as Gail's protector. Now Gail was refusing protection in the form Brooke had designed. Fear had built the plan, but the person at its center no longer wanted the plan. Ethan asked Gail whether she was sure. She said she was sad, not confused. She wanted the sale handled carefully, with enough time to keep what mattered and distribute the rest. She also wanted the proceeds directed toward her care. "I would rather spend my asset than Ruth's," she said. Her voice was steady now. Brooke began crying. She said she had only been trying to keep her mother from losing everything at once. Gail reached across the table and took her hand. "I know," she said, "but you were protecting me from a choice I still had the right to make." The room became very quiet after that. I let them sit with it. I watched Brooke's face soften, then harden again. She looked at me and said none of this changed what I had done to Ethan's inheritance. I told her she was right about one thing. Gail's decision and my trust decision were separate. I had changed the trust because expected inheritance had already started influencing present behavior. Ethan asked whether I thought he was irresponsible. I said no. Then I told him the truth more carefully. "I think you let future money make today's problem easier to avoid." He looked down at his hands. I had seen those hands once, small enough to fit inside mine. Now they belonged to an adult man. He looked smaller for a moment. He said he had believed I would help because I always had. I nodded. Then I said, "You were spending the version of me who never said no." Ethan closed his eyes. Brooke stopped crying. Gail looked at me for a long moment, then slowly nodded. The sentence hurt because it was true for all of us. No one contradicted me. I did not say it with pride. I had helped create that version of myself. I answered needs before requests, solved problems before others carried them, and confused being dependable with being endlessly available. My family had learned from my pattern. Changing the pattern would feel unfair to people who benefited from it. That did not mean the pattern had to continue. Gail's condo was listed the following week with an agent she chose. She asked me to attend one meeting, and I did. I sat beside her but said little. Her attorney reviewed the paperwork. Brooke came too, though she mostly listened. That was progress in its own quiet way. The condo sold faster than expected. The price was not perfect, but it was fair. After closing costs and Gail's remaining obligations, the proceeds created a meaningful reserve for her care. She cried the day she signed, then asked the agent where to donate a dining set she no longer needed. Grief and practicality sat side by side. The assisted living community accepted her updated funding plan without my trust listed anywhere. Gail paid from her own resources, benefits, and the condo proceeds. I contributed toward one therapy expense because I chose to. I wrote the check directly to the provider. The amount was modest. The choice felt clean. Brooke did not thank me for that check, and I did not need her to. For several weeks, our conversations remained brief. I understood her anger. She had built a rescue plan and watched every supporting assumption disappear. What she had not yet understood was that losing control of a plan is not the same as losing love. Ethan began calling me on Sunday evenings again. He did not ask about the trust. The first few calls were awkward, full of weather and hospital stories. I let them be awkward. Repair does not always begin with a perfect apology. Sometimes it begins when people stop reaching for the same lever that caused the damage. By late March, the last snow had disappeared from the shaded corner of my yard. I stood at the kitchen window and watched dark soil emerge beneath the feeder. A cardinal landed on the bare branch above it. Winter had not ended dramatically. It had simply loosened, one frozen layer at a time. The change felt almost gentle. Gail was safe. Her condo was gone, but her choices were still hers. Ethan remained my son. Brooke remained part of my family. The trust remained protected. None of those facts cancelled the others. I made tea, opened the cedar box once, then closed it again. There was nothing left to rescue that evening. By early June, Madison had turned green again. The snowbanks were gone. The sidewalks were dry, and Gail had been living in assisted care for nearly 2 months. I visited one Thursday afternoon. She was cheerfully arguing with a nurse about where to hang a framed photograph of her old condominium. She looked stronger. Her room was smaller than the home she had sold, but it looked unmistakably hers. She had chosen pale curtains, brought one favorite chair, and filled a shelf with family pictures. The condominium was gone. Her identity had not disappeared with it. That distinction seemed to have given her more peace than anyone expected. Gail told me she still missed her kitchen in the mornings. Then she added that she liked having help nearby when her balance felt uncertain. She was using the proceeds from her condo exactly as she had chosen. The decision remained sad in places, but sadness was no longer being treated like proof that the decision was wrong. Brooke visited her often. Their relationship had changed after the sale, though Gail did not describe every detail. She only said, "My daughter is learning to ask what I want before telling me what I need." I smiled. It sounded familiar. Some lessons travel through a family because more than one person needs them. Ava's high school graduation arrived the following Saturday. The ceremony was held in a bright gymnasium, filled with folding chairs, camera phones, and people trying not to cry. I sat beside Gail while Ethan and Brooke sat on her other side. For 2 hours, nobody mentioned money. That absence felt like a kind of healing. When Ava crossed the stage, Brooke reached for Ethan's hand. Gail clapped until her palms turned pink. I thought about the baby bracelet in Samuel's cedar box, and the girl now walking toward adulthood in a blue graduation gown. Generations can make time feel both enormous and very small. I let myself enjoy it. After the ceremony, Ava found me near the entrance and wrapped both arms around my shoulders. She said, "Grandma, I did it." I told her she had. Then she asked if I was still willing to help with college books that fall. I said yes. She had asked clearly. I had answered freely. The simplicity moved me more than she knew. I had already arranged a direct contribution to her education account. The money would go toward qualified school expenses, not through her parents' checking account. I told Ava I was helping because I wanted to. The gift gave no one else permission to plan beyond what I had chosen. That mattered. To me. She nodded, then laughed and said I sounded like a contract. I laughed too. Years at a credit union had probably made that unavoidable, but there was warmth inside the rule. Clear help leaves less room for resentment later. I wanted Ava to receive generosity without inheriting the pressure that had surrounded the trust. The graduation lunch took place at a small restaurant near the lake. Brooke was polite with me, but not relaxed. That was fine. Trust does not rebuild on command. We talked about Ava's dorm, Gail's therapy, and the weather. Nobody tried to force intimacy into the room before it was ready. I appreciated the restraint. Ethan called me the next Sunday at his usual time. By then, those calls had become ordinary again. He asked about my garden and told me a story from work. He did not ask what the trust was worth, who controlled it, or whether anything had changed. The absence of those questions mattered more than an apology repeated every week. Several times I nearly brought the trust up myself. Old habits can make a mother over-explain even after nobody asks. I stopped. If Ethan wanted a relationship with me that was not organized around inheritance, I had to let that relationship exist without testing it. Love did not need another financial conversation every Sunday. One evening he came over to repair a loose hinge on my back gate. Samuel would have fixed it in 10 minutes. Ethan took 20 and complained that his father had made every repair look easier than it was. I handed him a screwdriver and said, that was one of his tricks. We worked side by side without discussing the past. When we finished, Ethan sat on the back step and asked whether I thought he had failed me. I said no. He had made a mistake, allowed pressure to shape his judgment, and expected my generosity to continue without asking clearly. Those things mattered. They were not the sum of his character. He listened without defending himself. Ethan said he felt embarrassed by how quickly he accepted the phrase, my inheritance. Hearing it repeatedly had made the money feel closer than it was. I nodded. Expectation can shorten time in dangerous ways. A future possibility starts feeling available, and today's decisions begin leaning on tomorrow's gift. Ethan said he no longer wanted to know the balance. I told him that was probably wise. Then he asked if I was still angry. I thought for a moment and said, no, but I am still certain. He understood what I meant. The documents would remain exactly as Patricia and I had arranged them. Certainty did not require hostility. Brooke's apology came 2 weeks later. She called first and asked whether she could stop by. That small question told me something had changed. I said yes. She arrived alone with no folders, no laptop, and no spreadsheet. She sat at my kitchen table while the afternoon sun moved slowly across the floor. For several minutes, Brooke talked about Gail. She said watching her mother fall had frightened her more than she admitted. Every apartment price felt like a threat, and every delay felt dangerous. Then she said fear had made her start treating solutions as permissions. She looked at me directly when she said it. She apologized for listing my trust on the facility paperwork, and for calling it Ethan's inheritance as if that made it available. She also apologized for telling me to stop interfering while asking me to fund the decision. The apology contained no request to change the trust. That mattered more than any dramatic words could have. I told her I accepted the apology. I did not say the damage had never happened. I did not promise the documents would return to their old form. Brooke nodded before I could explain. I know, she said. For the first time, she seemed to understand that forgiveness and restored access were separate decisions. She admitted something else. Preserving Gail's condo had become a test of whether she was a good daughter. She had been so afraid of failing her mother that she started assigning the cost of success to everyone around her. I understood that kind of fear. I also understood why understanding it could not make the behavior acceptable. We made tea. Brooke asked whether Gail had shown me the photographs in her new room. I said yes. The e-conversation moved toward ordinary things without anyone forcing it. That was enough for one afternoon. When Brooke left, she thanked me for listening. I did not mistake one good visit for complete repair, but I allowed it to be good. Later that week, Patricia sent the final organized copies of my estate documents. I reviewed the summary once and returned it to the fire-resistant box. Ethan's future share remained protected. Ava's education provisions remained separate. Nothing in the trust changed because Brooke had apologized. The apology did not need that reward. That evening, I opened Samuel's cedar keepsake box. Ethan's newborn hospital bracelet still lay beneath the knitted cap. I placed a small photograph from Ava's graduation beside it. In one box sat a helpless infant and a young woman stepping into adulthood. The contrast made the lesson feel complete. I had once protected Ethan because he could not protect himself. Later, I had to protect our adult relationship by refusing to solve what he was capable of carrying. Ava would need the same respect in a different form. Love changes as people grow. If it does not, protection can become control from either direction. I closed the cedar lid and ran my hand across the grains Samuel had sanded decades earlier. The box no longer felt like evidence that I should keep rescuing my son. It felt like evidence that he had already grown beyond rescue. That was not abandonment. It was recognition of the adult life we had raised him to have. On Sunday, Ethan called again. We talked about tomatoes, Ava's dorm list, and whether Gail would join us for a summer picnic. Before hanging up, he said, "Love you, Mom." I said it back. No one mentioned inheritance. For the first time in months, that silence felt completely natural, instead of carefully maintained. If you have stayed with me this far, tell me what you think. Should an expected inheritance ever be counted before it is received? And if someone you love began planning around money you still owned, would you change the structure or trust that one conversation was enough? Your answer may help someone else. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the cedar box nearby and the windows open to warm June air. Gail was safe. Ava had a future she was building herself. Ethan was still my son. Brooke was still family. The trust was still protected. None of those truths needed another one to disappear, shrink, or become less true. I turned off the kitchen light and left Samuel's cedar box on the shelf where it had always belonged. Tomorrow would bring ordinary calls, ordinary bills, and ordinary family life. That was exactly what I wanted. Nothing in the trust needed changing for peace to return. Love still had a place at my table. Entitlement no longer had a seat. What happened to Ruth was not really about assisted living or $175,000. It was about the moment a future gift became part of a present budget without the giver's consent. Brooke was frightened for her mother, and that fear was understandable. Gail needed care. But compassion does not give anyone authority over another person's assets. Ruth could care deeply, offer rides, pay a specific bill, and still refuse to turn her trust into a standing family guarantee. A loving response can be generous without becoming automatic, and a caring person still has the right to choose where responsibility begins and ends. The second lesson is that expected inheritance should never become current collateral. Ethan did not own Ruth's trust while she was alive, and Brooke could not make it more available by calling it his inheritance. Once people begin counting money they have not received, that expectation can quietly shape choices. It can postpone hard decisions, protect other assets, and create pressure on the person who still owns the money. Ruth's amendment did not remove Ethan from her future. It changed the structure so future benefit could not be pledged, assigned, or spent in advance. The final lesson is about adult children and rescue. Ruth had once protected Ethan because he was a helpless infant. Decades later, loving him required something different. He was capable of facing hard financial limits, making mistakes, and carrying consequences. Refusing to rescue him was not abandonment. It was a recognition of his adulthood. Gail made her own decision, sold her own condo, and paid for her own care. Ethan rebuilt his relationship with Ruth without discussing money. Brooke apologized without receiving restored access. That is what healthy repair can look like. You can leave someone a future without letting them spend your present.